Hello and welcome to another episode of the CIRS Group podcast. I'm JC,
And I'm Barbara.
and today we are going through some of the talks that we heard at CIRSx. We just got back this week, and this is hot off the presses. Today we're going to be going over remediation, testing, and inspections. So in our recap episode, we kind of mentioned we were going to break it up into 3 different episodes, but it's actually going to be 5 different episodes. 2 of them are going to be remediation. This one is the testing and inspections. Before we jump into the content itself, we just want to remind you we are not medical information or professionals. We are CIRS patients. We have a community of people who are healing from CIRS. We go to conferences about mold, but none of that qualifies us as medical advice. So definitely make sure you are seeking out the correct professional, whether that's a provider or an IEP, indoor environmental professional, who would be the person advising your remediation if you do need advice.
Yes. And some of the guys that we'll be talking about today actually are for hire. So we'll have some information in the show notes in case you guys want to pursue that for your own situations. So the first talk of the whole conference really was the endotoxin talk. Dr. D made lots of stinky jokes about poo. But yeah, that was with Dr. Dorninger and Michael Schrantz, and Michael Schrantz is an IEP, indoor environmental professional. So JC, if you remember our initial recap episode, you'll know that JC missed this talk live. Unfortunately, thanks to wonderful weather and flight cancellations, technically. Really, this whole talk was near and dear to my heart because endotoxin happens to be my biotoxin. I'm apparently very proud of this. But the problem with endotoxins is they can be the worst for brain atrophy. So if that is something that you are dealing with as your exposure, just know that it is affecting your brain probably more strongly than some of the other biotoxins, and all the more reason to make sure you take care of it, test for it, eradicate it from your environment, which is what this talk was all about. One interesting thing that I got out of the talk was that it won't necessarily smell if you have a problem. Smell would mean there's an active leak, like you're actually, like there's some real issue, which hopefully you can physically see in some way. But just because there's no poop smell doesn't mean you don't have a poop problem. So some of the gases that you can get meters for, have your inspector get a meter for, is for hydrogen sulfide or carbon dioxide even. Just make sure you're not breathing on it when you're using the meter. But yeah, that was something that I found interesting about the endotoxin situation. So the next thing they went over is testing for it. The testing, obviously, you've heard us talk a lot about the EnviroBiomics test, and this would be test number 5 on their website, which we will link to in the show notes. It's going to collect the dead and alive endotoxins, and it will also tell you how many you have. The score on that test will say up to 200 is safe, but according to Dr. Shoemaker, you want less than 100 on this test. Once you have figured out there's a problem with your endotoxin dust sampling test, then you can move on to smoke testing. Smoke testing is an expensive test. It can be anywhere from $500 to $1,000, depending on your area. But what the professional will do is actually put smoke into your sewage system and pump it in there and see where it comes out. And wherever it comes out is going to be your problem. So it's a very kind of intense test because your house might actually look like it's on fire. In fact, one of the big tips of the talk was to call your fire department and make sure they know you're doing this test before you do it, because you could get an unnecessary visit from a concerned neighbor. So I thought that was interesting. But you can use theater gas or dry ice, and dry ice is better for those that are chemically sensitive. Now, of course, this is better also for on-slab and crawl space built homes. But if you have, some underground sewage lines that you need to deal with, a sewer scope is going to be the better test. And I think that is unfortunately more expensive. And we've mentioned a few DIY options in the past on this podcast, but just to kind of reiterate, some of the most common sources of endotoxins are going to be unused drains. And so you'll want to pour 3 to 4 cups of water with mineral oil, would help, but you don't need that part, every 2 to 3 weeks, just to make sure that that P trap under every drain is full. Because if it's dried out, that's how the sewage gas can get back up into your home. If you
And
have any,
mineral oil is so that as the water evaporates, you still have the mineral oil trapping the smells or the endotoxins, I should say.
yeah, so that it keeps the water from evaporating as fast, and like the mineral oil itself is not going to evaporate like water will. So yeah, that's basically just to make that process last longer. So you're
Mm.
filling up the drain less often. It's just for convenience. The product that they recommend to deal with clogged or dirty drains is Green Gobbler. No, not Green Goblin, as we talked about in our recent group call within the CIRS group. But Green Gobbler, it's not a perfect product, but it is one that I think is the go-to amongst CIRS professionals. Some other possible concerns you may want to look at, just from my own personal experience as possible sources of endotoxin, is your washing machine, your dishwasher, and your garbage disposal. You want to make sure they are draining properly, that the pipes are leaning the right direction. You may want to open those up and clean them out, or really ideally have a professional or someone who doesn't have CIRS do it for you. If you have eradicated any possible endotoxins and you still have a bad test result, those might be the next thing to check out and to clean. That's my own personal advice, just from my own personal experience. And of course, one other thing to cover is what you want to avoid, if you can, to avoid endotoxins in general, is like compost, farming, kitty litter, animal feed. And also, if you drink so much that you throw up, and your head is in the toilet, probably not a good way to avoid endotoxins. So I know that can be hard for some of our members that might be homesteading or living more rurally, but you do want to avoid those places that you could get some endotoxin hits from.
Wow, I'm so upset I missed all the poop jokes.
Oh, there were so many between Dr. D and Schrantz. It was just poop joke central. There's some questionable pictures used in the slides, I have to say. Some like
Interesting.
maybe more gross than needed type of pictures, but it got the point across.
Well, I'm excited to watch the replay of that one.
But one talk that you did get to see was from the UK, so I'll let you take this one.
I like how you're also letting me pronounce his name. So it's a Finnish doctor.
You
And
knew that. You knew that's what I
and his name was Dr. Jari Louhelainen, and that is my best guess because they were making a lot of jokes. So I don't know which were the jokes and which were really his name. So we're just going to call him Dr. Jari. But he did a talk about air quality. He's not necessarily like involved in the CIRS space. He's just the leading European expert on air quality. At CIRSx, I always bring in a couple of speakers who are kind of CIRS adjacent, but not necessarily directly related to CIRS. So he was just coming from the perspective of air quality in general. And he kind of confirmed my belief that the UK is the Florida of Europe, in the sense that for whatever reason, the humidity, the moisture content, and the building practices, which we learned, it's just a harder environment for CIRS patients to live in because it is just so much more prone to mold. So a couple of interesting things that he said were that only 7 countries meet the air quality standards set by the World Health Organization. Only 7, like out of all the countries. This is not just Europe. He also said that indoor air is worse than diesel fumes. Typically, indoor air is 100 times more polluted than air on the street. And that was wild to me. Like the fact that the air in your home could be worse than standing like in the middle of a street. That is wild.
Yeah, it is crazy. I guess because everything if the building is not constructed properly, things just get sucked on in to the indoor air, and it's just this contained trap of toxins. Whereas at least if you're outside, there's like fresh air and trees and lots of other things, helping the process along. But that was really impactful to me too.
He he's just so excited by science too. Because
Yeah.
one thing he said was like, we can make the invisible visible. And that was like a really, like he said it, like it was a really profound thing. And it is a profound thing. Like we live in a time of magic. We have things like PCR machines. He actually is patenting patenting.
Oh,
What
no.
am I? He is getting something patented very shortly. It's a
Yeah.
real-time PCR machine. So what they can do is they can do air sampling, which we're going to talk about air sampling in a bit, but they can air sample and in real time know what species of mold are in that air sample, which I thought was fascinating. And we were talking, I think it was Dr. D at some point during CIRSx said that it'd be really cool if we could have, we have radon detectors and we have like CO2 detectors. It would be so cool if we had a mold detector. And if you combine an air oasis, which is like an air filter, with a real-time PCR machine, that's it. That's your real-time mold detector. So
Yeah.
hopefully maybe someday in the future we're gonna have something that can do that. Although by the time the mold is there, it's like you still have to remediate, but at least you know sooner rather than later.
Yeah, you know that you're in that situation rather than just getting sick and sick and sicker. Yeah.
The only other thing I had in my notes, and I know you're gonna talk about a different aspect of his talk, was he was talking about HEPA filters and how they're kind of the gold standard, but they're not good enough. They are just inherently not very robust. Like they are very prone to damage or being installed incorrectly. And so what we think of as our first line of defense in normal spaces, not even like in the SIRS space, people, place this really high value on HEPA filters, when in reality, he has found that they're not as effective as they should be because of poor installation or poor maintenance.
Right. Yeah. It was something to think about. Just the even the filter in its perfect form is still not filtering out the tiniest of little particles. And of course, the tiniest of particles, when we breathe them in, can go the furthest within our lungs and cause major issues. Yeah, the biggest takeaway, in addition to what you covered, because everything you covered was great too, the big like emotional impact that I had from that talk was just the prevalence of government cover up and like leaders of like there was a principal of a school that had major issues and the students were really sick and he was very specifically doing these incredibly ridiculous tactics to get the inspectors off of the property and to not let them in to actually find the problem. And it just goes to show how it's such a huge, expensive issue, and to acknowledge its reality for a lot of these powers that be would actually put a huge, really insurmountable financial burden on those powers that they just don't want to deal with. So they're very strongly incentivized to pretend that it's okay. And oh, there's mold on the window. Yeah, I'll wipe it off. Oh, look, there's no mold now. Like that's how they solve problems there. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people here in the States too, and probably across the world solve mold problems that way too. So that was a shame. And he had some images of government funded housing in some of the poorer areas of the UK that were just really heartbreaking to see. And it just kind of goes to show what a huge problem this is.
It's Birmingham. So if anyone is a Peaky Blinders fan, it was there.
Yes. Yes, there you go. Perfect. And that's yeah, that part is what really hurt to see. So I hope that the more that we talk about this and the more people know about it, the more changes can actually happen.
So the next talk was by Bill Weber. He is also an IEP, and I think he's located in Southern California, right? I'm like 80% sure.
I believe you.
Yeah, 80% sure on that. But his talk was really great. It was about mold sampling method. So people who are familiar with CIRS or the Shoemaker protocol are probably aware that most of the providers and IEPs recommend that you do dust sampling. It's through EnviroBiomics. It's called the ERMI if you get the full panel, HERSMI if you get the shortened panel. Bill Weber was really talking about the pros and cons of air sampling versus dust sampling.
Yeah. And I love this quote, and I'll just directly quote him because it was such a perfect metaphor. Mold is like a pine tree. Air samples catch the pine cones, while the dust sampling, like the ERMI and Hurts Me Too, gets the whole tree. And the reason that that's important is that you do want to know if you're dealing with dead or alive and what species you're dealing with, because that can indicate what is going on in your environment. It's just giving you a lot more information to help you or your IEP or both play detective to get to the root of the problem. I mean, that's a big summary of like why dust samples are better than air samples. Now, air sampling has its place, and IEPs, if you're having someone show up to your house and they are like being thorough about it, they are probably going to use multiple ways of testing. And that was kind of his point. Each version of testing has its strengths and weaknesses. And when you do them all in conjunction with each other, it's going to give you the full picture of what exactly you're dealing with. Just to give you a few examples, air sampling is great because it gives you the airborne content. So it's like what you're actually breathing in, but it's kind of catching it just in that moment of time while the cassette is running. And if you've had an air sample done, basically they set up like a little cassette on a tripod and they just let it run. They let it run for a certain amount of time and then they stop it, and then they take that cassette to a lab and then they tell you what they find. The problem with that though is that it's only facing one direction. It's very it's limited on like the timing, the time of day. Did you have a window open in that room? Did you have a lot of people walking through the room, or was the HVAC system totally off and the windows totally shut and all the particles are actually on the floor because they're not being disturbed at all? Like all of that matters. And that's where you could see where using the air sample in conjunction with the dust sample is going to give you that full picture of what is really going on. And I love that he even goes into, recreating a normal living situation. Like if you are a family of four with a dog, have the family of four and the dog in the living room while you're testing the living room. Like have them walking around, talking, playing with the dog or whatever they're doing, because that is normal movement for real life. And that will mean that your test is actually testing your real life experience of the mold.
And a really cool piece of that, and why you might want to consider air sampling, especially if, there's going to be litigation down the road. We'll get into this when we get into the more legal talks that there were at CIRSx, but Bob McKee did a talk where he was talking about how he loves air sampling for juries because he can show them the spore count per a cubic foot. And that's really motivating to juries because they can conceptualize that, they can understand that, they can picture that. So when you're doing the air sampling, it's another piece of the puzzle for the IEP, certainly, but also, especially if you're going to be going into litigation, it can be super helpful for that. And if that is kind of the route that you're going, you especially want to have that recreation of the real world environment, because the worst case scenario would be to get an air sample that doesn't have a lot of spores, because the IEP is still going to have to report that. You can't just leave that information out.
Yeah, great point. And that is another point to definitely do the inspection yourself with someone that you have hired, as opposed to if, let's say, if you're renting and you have let your landlord bring in an inspector, because they can do some tricky stuff to manipulate those results. They can turn your HVAC system off for a full 24 hours, close all the windows, let it all settle, and then do an air sample test and screw with the results. So just know that you want to do your own testing before you even report a problem in some cases, just to make sure of your results and make sure you've locked in what that test is showing.
Yeah, and just to double down on what you said, your own testing through an IEP. Like you
Right.
don't want to be the only person doing the testing. You want kind of like that third party. But there was an IEP at CIRSx who said the only way they knew that another air testing company had done some shady stuff was because the homeowners had cameras. And so they actually saw that the other mold inspector stick the cassette out the window. So they didn't even test the indoor environment. Like, how mad does that make you? Like, I can feel the heat rising in me. Like, the people, to your point where you were in the last talk, it's so financially precarious for people to have to deal with this that the stakes are so high, they do some really shady stuff.
Yeah, it's wild. It's really wild. Thank you for bringing that up because, yeah, that was a really good point. And then the final talk on this, at least in this subcategory that we've pulled together, was by Brandon Apple, yet another IEP. We love our IEPs. He's an inspector, I think, in the Colorado area near Dr. Dorninger. And so Dr. Dorninger works a lot with him. And
They
he's talked.
also have, sorry, there's so Brandon Apple, the guy who owns and I can't remember the name of his company right now, but we'll definitely have it in the show notes. He has one part of his company in Colorado, but the other part of the company is near Frisco. So actually around the area where we went to the conference at.
Oh, cool. He should look
Yeah.
at the hotel that we
Yeah.
stayed at.
Someone should have him look at the hotel.
Yeah, but thank you for that. Yeah, that's great. And so he handled or covered the sequencing of remediation and renovations and small particle cleaning. So that is a very important topic that he covered. And JC, do you want to summarize that? Because you summarized it beautifully before.
Yeah, so just conceptually, we are familiar with the 12 steps of the Shoemaker protocol, and that's really what he's trying to get to. Last year at CIRSx, Dr. D had said that they were trying to get like a remediation protocol down. And so that's what he's been working on with Brandon Apple. And this is what they tried to pull together. So you can kind of think of these steps as like the 12 steps of the Shoemaker protocol, but it's the 12, well, more than 12 steps of the remediation protocol. But the big summary for me was like, first of all, you assess the situation, then you sequester all the different areas. You like block them off from each other. So if you're dealing with the HVAC, you're just dealing with the HVAC. If you're dealing with remediating one room, you seal off that room. But then after each and every step of the protocol, which I have 8 steps, but some of them have like step 5B and 7B I have in my notes, and I
Right.
have a 7C too. And those additional like B, C notes that I have is after every step, you have to verify. You have to verify that the remediation was done correctly. You have to verify that the rebuild was done correctly. You have to verify that the HVAC cleaning was done correctly. And the verification is so important because if you get through the entire protocol and you're not verifying along the way, and you find out at the very end there's a problem, you have to go back to step one.
Yeah. And you don't know where the problem is. So you're going to have to investigate every single piece to find where that is. Yeah, like that was an example that they used even in last year's CIRSx too, was somebody got remediation done, busted open a bunch of walls, fixed it, cleaned it, closed up all the walls, retested, and went, oh crap, we're worse now, or something terrible like that, right? And like they already closed up the walls. That's the part where don't close up the walls yet. Clean the area, do all the stuff, and then test before you close up things. Because that's going to give you that, like you said, verify that the work was done the right way. You didn't miss anything in the process, and it is actually safe to put some drywall back up or whatever you need to do to close up that situation.
Should I go through the actual steps?
Sure, yeah, if you want to read through them, I think that'll be great.
So the first one was inspection and testing. 2 was HVAC assessment. 3 was planning with a timeline that is very, yeah, very flexible timeline. Expect that there are going to be changes to the timeline. However, you need a timeline so you can like base your planning off of it. Dr. D always says never trust an on-time remediator because the ones that are doing a good job are staying there and making sure they're doing things correctly. He says the same thing about CIRS providers too.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Step 4 is gross remediation, which means gross as in like
The
the big,
blatant.
yeah, the big part, but also like the gross mold part.
Yeah.
And then 5 is demolition. 6 is reconstruction. And he said that typically there's a little bit of scope creep on this step where people, because they're already going to be rebuilding certain aspects of their home, they may want to impact other more aesthetic parts of their home. And then 7 was HVAC cleaning and 8 was small particle cleaning. Now, again, throughout that, he kept verifying
hmm
after
Yeah.
each of those steps, making sure that it was done correctly.
Yeah. And I thought one other thing I'll add to what you said is that he really encouraged the homeowner to lean into that IEP, the CIRS-literate IEP, to do the demo, to be there supervising what's going on. So even if you're like, well, my kitchen had a leak, I'm renovating the kitchen, so I'm just going to have this like aesthetic focused, general contractor come in and make my kitchen pretty now. You still want the IEP there in case they're blowing out the other cabinets that you think aren't affected. that IEP is going to be able to visually go, oh, wait, there's a problem here that we didn't see before, that the other guy or girl may not pick up on, because they're not programmed and trained to look for the water damage the way that a real IEP would be. So that was another big important key thing. Like, it's going to be more expensive to keep that IEP involved in every aspect, but really it's better to do that than to cut any corners in this situation.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot cheaper in the long run versus re-exposing your entire newly remediated home to new issues.
Yeah, and by the way, just so you guys know, the verification process often means, okay, you've done some cleaning. You now have to sit there with that empty home while you're displaced, probably, and let dust collect for at least 2 weeks to do the ERMI or the HERTSMI, to do the verification process. So we're talking adding weeks of nothing being done at your house just to verify. And so it can be very tempting to skip this process, but it is very important. If you're doing a big job and you're already spending close to or above $100,000, like, just, it's going to be worth that extra couple weeks to just make sure that it's done right, so you're not doubling or tripling or beyond your full costs in the end.
We have a group member that berates me every time I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Like, that just makes me not want to be a homeowner. Like,
Yeah.
it, I know that what I did was hard, just up and leaving my family home in Florida, moving to Colorado with only the things I had in a carry-on, not being able to be with my family. Like, that is hard. That is objectively hard. But remediating your home, that's hard too. And so I just want to validate that for anyone who's like staring down that barrel. That is a hard thing to have to go through, and that is a hard thing to process. And listening to Brandon talk, and I would say this about all of the IEPs that we met at CIRSx, and I think to be an IEP at CIRSx, you have to have a certain heart for a CIRS patient, because it is not easy work. They are doing double, triple the amount of verification and cleaning that a normal remediator would be doing, because they know that our health is on the line. They know that our lives are on the line. And so I love the IEPs. I love them so much, and they are so down to earth, and they're all so kind and have such a big heart for this. Just all the love to the IEPs.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a good, yeah, a really good point. The amount of patience that they have to have, and the amount of patience that they have to hopefully educate their homeowner about as well, that they're going to need to have. Yeah, I can attest. I'm a homeowner, and in 1 month we replaced the HVAC, and then realized the dishwasher broke, and then had to clean the washing machine, and then all of a sudden our garbage disposal broke. And all of that was on us. It wasn't something like, oh, let's break the lease and leave. No, we own it. We have to deal with it. So it is an extra layer to consider, depending on what your situation looks like.
Well, if you're looking for more resources and support, if you want to hear about some of our members' experiences with various IEPs, we might have a suggestion for someone in your area even, you can join us over at theCIRSgroup.com.
We'll see you there.